I'm a ranger, and I've seen all kinds of things, but what I stumbled upon that cold, foggy night was something no amount of experience could prepare me for. The campfire was still smoldering when I found it. Tents torn apart, belongings scattered, but it was the blood that caught my eye. So much blood. It was spattered across the ground, the leaves, the tents. I could almost hear the screams that must have filled the air. My heart pounded in my chest. Fear crept up my spine. I thought back to the brutal murder that had happened only a month ago in a neighboring campground. A family of 4 that was missing, their campground found covered in blood. They never caught who did it. Was this the work of the same hand? The silence of the forest was a haunting melody. Every rustle of the wind was a whisper of danger. I fumbled for my radio but stopped. What if they were still nearby? What if they heard me? I needed to leave. I needed to get help. But my legs were heavy and my mind was a whirlwind of terror. The murderer was out there, and they could be watching me. As I stumbled back towards my truck, I felt eyes on me. The darkness seemed to close in, the shadows twisting into sinister shapes. My breath came in ragged gasps. It was just a trick of the mind, I told myself, just the wind and the trees. But as I reached the safety of my vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror at the shrinking outline of the dark forest. But in my mind, the bloody campsite remained, and I knew, deep in my bones, that the nightmare was far from over. The killer was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim, waiting for me.
Our romantic weekend getaway was a cherished pause from our daily routines. The sun glistened over the lake as we unloaded our bags into our Airbnb. The cottage, nestled right onto the waterfront, was every bit as picturesque as the listing had promised. Mature trees framed the home, their leaves rustling with every gentle breeze. Birds sang in the distance. We reveled in the tranquil setting. The kayaks bobbed on the lake's edge, waiting for adventurers to paddle out. We strolled around the property, discovering the comforts it offered: a perfectly built fire pit, a wood-burning pizza oven, and a modern barbecue grill. With every new discovery, our smiles grew wider. This was the perfect place. As the afternoon wore on, we lounged by the water, the sun's rays warming our skin, the gentle lapping of the lake creating a peaceful melody. By sunset, the sky had transformed into a canvas of orange, pink, and purples, with the lake reflecting those hues. The entire scene was idyllic. Drawn to the telescope set up by the window, I motioned to my wife to come and have a look. The telescope was a sophisticated piece, and we marveled at how clear and detailed the view was. It gave us a vantage point directly across the lake. We took turns, scanning and observing. Houses were scattered, standing proudly on their lakefront properties. As the telescope's lens moved, I focused on a particularly grand house, a large white estate that looked pristine and opulent. Its expansive windows displayed magnificent artwork. The well-maintained yard was adorned with intricate statues, and luxury cars parked to the side only accentuated its grandeur. However, a sudden flurry of movement caught my attention. In one of the large windows, I could see a woman, her face distorted with terror, sprinting through her home. Hot on her heels was another figure, obscured in shadow, but unmistakably chasing her. My heart raced as I observed the scene, feeling as if I was intruding on a dark moment that wasn't meant for outside eyes. I urged my wife to look as the man, clutching what looked like a bat, took a devastating swing. Blood sprayed across the pristine white walls. The woman crumpled to the ground. We both gasped in horror. The weight of what we had just witnessed was pressing down on us. Our romantic getaway had taken a dark turn. Trembling, we realized the importance of acting fast. We might have been the only witnesses to the crime. Frantically, we pulled out our phones. Using satellite images, we pinpointed the exact location of the house. As we dialed the police, explaining the horrific scene we just witnessed, we continued to watch through the telescope, hoping the woman was okay. Before long, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. They grew louder, culminating in a cacophony of flashing blue and red lights of the house. But then, a rapid succession of gunfire erupted, each pop echoing across the lake, making our hearts race further. As the echoes subsided, I refocused the telescope and watched in shock as a figure scrambled from the house, rushing to the dock. A boat engine roared to life, and the vessel darted across the lake, heading straight for our side. My partner and I exchanged fearful glances, realizing that not only were we witnesses, but we might now be targets. The hum of the boat engine grew louder, its intensity slicing through the thick veil of silence that had settled over the lake. Panic gripped us, our minds racing for an escape plan. "Let's kill the lights," my wife whispered. We quickly doused all the lights in our Airbnb. Ensconced in the shadows, we looked around for places to hide. The house felt alien now, a maze of uncertainty. We should barricade ourselves in the bedroom, I suggested. Grabbing nearby furniture, we started barricading the entrance to the bedroom. The weighty wooden dresser, the sturdy coffee table, the long sofa were all haphazardly stacked against the door. Each second felt like a minute, every minute an hour. Outside, the roar of the boat's engine ceased, replaced by the soft creaking of its dock against the pier. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Through the window, we caught a glimpse of a figure, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hooded jacket, and holding something metallic in one hand. Likely the bat we had seen earlier. His movements were purposeful, his demeanor predatory. This was someone used to hunting. We could hear him trying the front door, its handle jiggling under his grip. The adrenaline in our veins spiked. We huddled behind our makeshift barrier, the only thing separating us from imminent danger. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing second. The police, and they were closer than we thought. Startled, the man outside turned his attention to the approaching vehicles. We could hear his cursing and mumbling, the sound of his hurried footsteps echoing as he raced back to his boat. The next moments were a whirlwind. The lake's perimeter was swarmed with police, their spotlights scanning every nook and cranny. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors churning the night air. Safe in the embrace of law enforcement, we recounted our harrowing tale. As dawn broke, the police informed us that the man was a known fugitive. The White House across the lake, it seemed, was one of his many hideouts. Though the experience was traumatizing, we took solace in the fact that our vigilance had likely saved others from a similar fate. However, our romantic getaway was forever tainted, serving as a stark reminder that danger could lurk even in the most unexpected places. We returned home, grateful for our safety and more vigilant than ever, cherishing the simple moments we once took for granted.
I had just finished a long day at work, and the exhaustion clung to my bones like a wet, heavy blanket. All I wanted was to get home, put my feet up, and forget about the world outside. My apartment building's lobby was always dimly lit, but today the soft hum of the elevator was more like a roar. As I pressed the call button, I could feel the tension in my body start to relax as I got closer to home. The elevator's dinging was a sweet sound, promising comfort on the way up to my bed. When the elevator doors finally slid open, my fatigue was momentarily replaced by shock and fear. The scene before me was a nightmare. The walls, floor, and the ceiling of the elevator were all smeared with a thick, dark, wet blood. It wasn't just a splatter here and there. It was as if the elevator had been dipped in blood. The metallic scent of iron hit me like a punch in the gut. My heart raced and my breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. Panic set in. I couldn't understand how something like this could happen. I fumbled for my phone, my trembling fingers struggling to dial 911. My voice quivered as I reported the gruesome discovery. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but it felt like hours before I heard the sirens approaching. As I waited for the police and paramedics, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the blood-soaked elevator. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Was it an attack? A sinister ritual? A murderer? The questions swirled in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, the authorities arrived, their stern faces reflecting a mix of concern and disbelief as they entered the elevator. The paramedics carefully examined the scene while the police officers began asking questions, trying to piece together the gruesome puzzle. Hours turned into a blur as investigators combed through the building, searching for answers. It wasn't until dawn that they discovered the source of the blood, a maintenance accident involving the elevator's hydraulic system. Tragically, a worker had been injured while performing repairs, leading to the horrifying scene that greeted me. A sense of relief washed over me as the investigators revealed the accidental nature of the gruesome event. While it was a tragic accident, it was a far cry from the deliberate horror I had initially feared. As the cleanup crew arrived to restore the elevator to its mundane function, I couldn't help but shudder at the thought of getting in there. I knew I'd never use that elevator again. I'll use the stairs until I move.
I was on a 2-week hiking trip on the Pacific Crest Trail. I don't usually hike at night, but the next outlook was only a mile further, and I thought the sunrise would be well worth the hour of hiking in the dark. As I ventured deeper into the dense, moonlit woods, the air grew thick with an eerie silence that sent shivers down my spine. My footsteps echoed through the stillness, each one a reminder of my solitude in this desolate forest. The rustling of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound. I had loved hiking alone, relishing the quiet and the feeling of being one with nature. But tonight, that quiet felt different, more oppressive, as if the very forest itself were watching and waiting. My heart raced with each step. My paranoia began to grow, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss in the woods. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiously, that relentless human trait pushed me onward. Then I stumbled upon it, a gruesome sight that froze blood in my veins. Half buried beneath a carpet of damp leaves, a mutilated body lay sprawled in the moonlight. The blood was still fresh, gleaming wet in the eerie glow of my flashlight. The victim's face was contorted in agony, eyes wide with terror, as if they had witnessed their own gruesome demise. Blood-soaked clothing clung to their lifeless form, and deep gashes crisscrossed their limbs. Flies buzzed hungrily around the open wounds, a grotesque symphony of death. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, horrified and sickened by the gruesome sight. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, urging me to flee, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. A chilling wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the haunting sound of a rustling forest floor, as if someone was still out there. I fumbled for my phone, thankful to have service, my trembling fingers struggling to dial 911. My voice quivered as I relayed my location to the dispatcher, desperately hoping for a lifeline out of this nightmare. Each passing second felt like an eternity, as if time itself had slowed in the presence of death. The minutes dragged on, my flashlight's feeble glow casting long, eerie shadows that flickered around the lifeless body. Each creak of a branch and snap of a twig seemed like it could be my end. Finally, the distant wail of sirens broke the spell, and I let out a shuddering breath. Help was on the way, but the memory of that gruesome discovery would haunt me forever. As I waited in the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder what sinister presence lurked in these woods, waiting for its next victim, and whether I had stumbled upon something best left undisturbed. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder that even the most serene of landscapes conceal horror beyond imagination, lurking in the shadows of the natural world.
The rain was pelting down as I fumbled with the keys to my apartment, shaking off the cold and the fatigue of a long workday. I expected to find Jake, my boyfriend, lounging on the sofa, immersed in the television with a new show or playing video games. The door creaked open to a hushed, unnatural silence. The lamp in the corner cast a feeble light across the room, just enough to reveal dark red smears across our cream-colored walls. My heart started racing. I called out, "Jake!" No response. Taking hesitant steps, I moved further in, trying to convince myself that it was some elaborate prank he'd set up, that he'd done this all as a stupid joke. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight in the living room. Jake lay motionless, a pool of blood surrounding him, his eyes wide open in fear, hands stretched out like he was reaching for something. Panic surged through me. Gasping for breath, I struggled to dial 911, my fingers trembling. The dispatcher's calm voice seemed distant and surreal as I stammered out the details. As I waited for the police, my gaze kept drifting back to Jake, trying to piece together the last moments of his life. The room bore signs of a struggle. A shattered vase, overturned furniture, and those chilling, bloody footprints leading out towards the window. When the police arrived, their investigation was meticulous. It was revealed that Jake had likely surprised an intruder, leading to a deadly confrontation. The police left tape on the scene, and it took weeks before I could convince myself to go back. Every night, I'd lie awake replaying that fateful evening over and over, haunted by the what-ifs, the image of Jake's last moments forever etched in my mind.
I've worked as a security guard at a shipping yard for almost a decade. I've seen a lot. Rusting metal causing forklift accidents, a couple of petty thefts, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on what was easily the scariest night of my life. It had been a long day. A software glitch had thrown the whole inventory system out of whack, and I've been running around, manually checking serial numbers on containers. By the time midnight had rolled around, I was eager to sit back in the control room, sip the thermos of stale coffee, and keep an eye on the monitors. The rain was coming down in sheets, each drop a stinging slap on the metal surfaces on the containers. On nights like this, even trespassers and thieves stayed away, and the yard was deserted, a maze of steel and shadow. I was about to take my first sip of coffee when something caught my eye on the CCTV monitor. It was a grainy figure, moving swiftly between the rows of containers. A trespasser? At this time of night? And in the rain? Setting my coffee aside, I grabbed my raincoat and radio. Once I was out in the yard, the rain immediately soaked through, sticking the fabric to my skin. But my focus was on the path ahead. I knew the layout like the back of my hand. A little rain wasn't going to deter me. Navigating through the labyrinth of towering containers, I reached the location where I'd seen the figure on the camera. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and I saw footprints, fresh, leading towards a particular set of containers. And then I saw it, what I'd been led here to find. A lifeless body lying on the ground. It was a man, mid-30s, dressed in work clothes that were now soaked and plastered to his body. His face was a mask of anguish, his eyes wide open in a permanent expression of shock. But what stopped me dead in my tracks was his chest. It was grotesquely carved open, organs missing. My stomach churned, bile rising to the back of my throat. I'd seen plenty of death in my years of service, but this was something else. This was deliberate, sickeningly so. My first instinct was to call it in, but I hesitated. This was sick and twisted. What if the person was still here, listening? My eyes darted around nervously, peering into the claustrophobic passages formed by the containers. I had the dreadful realization that if someone wanted to disappear in here, they could do so easily. In fact, they could be watching me right now. It was then that I heard it. A faint scuffling sound, followed by what seemed to be like a stifled cough from somewhere behind me. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't alone. And that's when all the lights went out. Pitch blackness engulfed the shipping yard. My heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing the seconds that slipped away in the dark. The rain was the only constant, but it seemed to grow ominously quiet, as if the sky itself held its breath. My radio lay silent, a dead weight in my hand. I've heard stories of a rumored killer in the area known for gruesomely harvesting organs from his victims. Thought they were just urban legends. But as I stood there, near such a horrifying sight, it was hard to dismiss those whispers. The scuffling sound returned, this time closer. My fingers fumbled into my pocket for the small flashlight I always carried. I switched it on, and the beam cut through the darkness like a blade. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the eyes of a killer staring back at me. But there was nothing, just endless rows of containers, like towering monoliths in a steel graveyard. Gripping my flashlight, I edged back towards the control room. Every footstep sounded like thunder, each shadow a lurking menace. Thoughts raced through my mind. Had the killer manipulated the electrical grid to shut off the lights? What if they were heading to the control room to wipe the CCTV footage? The muddy ground sucked at my boots as I quickened my pace. Adrenaline surging, I made a run for it. Every cell in my body screamed to get out, to escape the maze where death itself seemed to walk. I could hear the figure chasing me, boots splashing in the muddy ground, drawing closer. Somehow, I burst out of the labyrinth of containers and into the relative openness of the yard. My eyes, adjusted to the darkness, caught the dim outline of the control room up ahead. Panting, soaked to the bone, I slammed the door shut behind me, my fingers hastily punching the emergency override. With a buzz and flicker, the lights in the yard came back to life. My eyes darted to the CCTV monitors, the dead man's lifeless body lying exactly where I saw it. The rain had washed some of the blood away, but the horror was just as vivid. I looked at the other monitors, across the yard, eyes darting from container to container, but they were all locked and secure. No signs of forced entry, no signs of anyone lurking. It was as if the perpetrator had vanished into thin air. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, racing towards the shipping yard, a chilling realization settled over me. Whoever did this was still out there. And the night was far from over.
When I was 16 and had just gotten my license, I was begging my parents to let me take the car out alone. Finally, I was allowed to drive the car by myself for the first time. I decided to go to the store for some candy and then was going to go to a friend's house. Coming out of the store, I realized I didn't remember where I parked at all. I just had the spare key, so there was no sound button. I wandered around row after row until in the distance I thought I saw it. Finally, I walked over and put the key in the door, and as I opened the door, a few things started to fall from the car. Some receipts and some toys, and it didn't make sense at all. It wasn't until I fully got the door open, about to crawl inside, when I saw it. This wasn't my car, and there was already someone sitting there. She was still buckled into the driver's seat, a slit across her throat that looked so deep her head was barely connected to the body. Blood poured down from her neck to the seat, to the floor. It was everywhere. Her head slumped backwards, and her eyes were barely open, her face frozen in fear and a ghostly white. I didn't know what to do, but I must have screamed as I stood there shaking. It seemed like forever before anyone came over. An old man came over, and I remember hearing him call the police and asking me for my parents' number. My mom beat the police officers there, and she held me until we heard the sirens. It's still an unsolved case in my city, and even though it's been years, I haven't ever been able to go back to that store.
I had come home later than usual, the weight of an extended work meeting still fresh on my mind. As I approached our house, the absence of light from the windows immediately struck me as odd. Emily always kept a light or two on when she was home, especially when it got dark. I unlocked the front door and stepped into an unsettling silence. "Emily?" I called, expecting her voice to break the stillness, but there was no answer. I walked through the living room and kitchen, noting the untouched dinner setting for two. The pit in my stomach deepened when I saw droplets of red on the hallway floor. With each step, the droplets became more frequent, guiding me with a sense of dread to our bedroom door. Pushing it open, my worst fears were realized. Emily was lying on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Blood seeped from a wound in her side, her once vibrant dress now marred with crimson. Overwhelmed with shock and grief, I reached out to touch her, but quickly withdrew my hand, realizing I should not disturb the scene. I called 911, voice trembling. The officers arrived swiftly. They processed the scene and asked questions. No sign of forced entry. The house was otherwise untouched. My mind raced. Could it have been someone we knew? A random act? Why'd this happen? The following days were a blur of police interviews, condolences, and sleepless nights. The investigators were as baffled as I was. There were no leads, no clear motives. Emily's belongings, including her cherished wedding ring, remained untouched. It was a mystery that would haunt me Every creak in the house, every rustle outside became a stark reminder of the traumatic evening and the fact that someone out there held the answers that continued to elude me.
The whirring of the machines filled the laundromat, the rhythmic hum luring me into a sort of trance. Most of the dryers and washers were occupied, except for a few. I needed to transfer my clothes from the washer to the dryer, hoping to get out of there before it got too late. I opened the lid of the nearest available dryer to ensure it was empty before loading my clothes. But what I saw wasn't the gleaming metal drum I was expecting. Instead, I was met with the pale, lifeless face of a man, his eyes wide in terror. I gasped, recoiling instantly, a scream threatening to break free. Blood seemed to paint the entirety of the dryer's interior, seeping into the vents and coating the drum. His body was twisted unnaturally, limbs contorted to fit the confined space. It looked like he had been folded. I backed away, my breathing erratic. Panic surged through me. The laundromat was quiet except for the dull drone of the machines, a stark contrast to the horror I'd just uncovered. I needed to tell someone, to scream for help, but my voice was stuck, and my legs felt rooted to the spot. As I forced my eyes away from the gruesome sight, I caught a fleeting movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow darted behind one of the washing machines, a low chuckle echoing from the darkness. The realization struck me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't alone, and whoever, or whatever was there with me, might have been responsible for the body. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, urging me to flee. I made a beeline to the exit, the sound of footsteps echoing mine, growing louder and more menacing. The glass door was mere feet away when a cold hand clamped down on my shoulder. I didn't dare look back. With a surge of strength, I shrugged it off and crashed through the door into the safety of the night. The cold air stung my face, but I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car. Even as I drove away, the image of the bloody body and the chilling laughter haunted my every thought. The laundromat's lights soon faded into my rearview mirror, but the nightmares of that night were just beginning.
My days had become routine, driving to and from work, always the same path, always the same scenery. But today, a detour took me through an old, isolated road that I'd never taken before. The thick woods on either side provided a dark canopy overhead, even in the late afternoon light. It was eerie, yes, but it was a welcome change. About halfway down, I saw it, a car positioned slightly off the road. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone needed help. As I got closer, I noticed a deep crimson hue covering the car, blood. It was everywhere, from the roof to the tires in large splatters and smeared handprints. Yet, as I approached the car, I noticed something odd. The car itself was undamaged. No dents, no shattered windows, nothing that might indicate an accident. Curiosity and a sense of dread held me in place. I looked inside. The interior was immaculate. No signs of struggle, no evidence of any violence, no bodies, no wounds, and again, no damage. The ignition was off, the keys were missing. Confused, I took out my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. As I deliberated on what to do next, I heard a rustling sound from the woods nearby. Cautiously, I followed the noise and came upon a clearing. What I saw there will haunt me forever. In the center of the clearing was a large makeshift table made from logs, covered in layers of clear plastic. Beside the table, a man stood, dressed in white overalls, stained in red. He was methodically cleaning a set of large, gleaming knives. The ground was wet, and blood was everywhere. Beside the table was a large container. Inside were human body parts, neatly severed and organized, a collection of horrors. The man noticed me and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just spotted its next meal. I ran. Panic surged through me as I sprinted back to my car. The sound of footsteps followed closely behind. I fumbled with my keys, and just as I managed to start the engine, a heavy thud landed on the roof of my car. I floored the accelerator, not daring to look back. Somehow, I managed to find my way back to the main road and straight to the nearest police station. They launched an immediate search, but by the time they arrived at the clearing, it was empty. The table, the tools, the man were all gone. Only the bloody car remained as evidence of the nightmare that took place. The police said they'd keep an eye out, but they couldn't do much without evidence. I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every rustle of the leaves, every shadow in the night, I thought it was him. I often wonder about that car. Who did it belong to? Was it a trap set by the man, or the remnants of his last victim? I'll never know. All I know is that somewhere out there, a monster walks free, and I pray that no one ever stumbles upon that isolated road.
I was fixing up my backyard one chilly autumn day. The air felt heavy with fallen leaves, and the sun barely peeked through the gray clouds. My garden was a mess, overgrown like a jungle. I grabbed a shovel and started digging near the big oak tree, wanting to clean up the place. thunk. My shovel hit something hard. I wiped sweat from my forehead and squatted down to see what I'd struck. When I saw that bony white thing staring back at me, my heart stopped for a moment. It was a skull. Human. Empty sockets that seemed to stare right through me. I dropped the shovel, my mind racing. This wasn't some Halloween prank. It was way too real. Panic set in, and I called the cops. As I waited, I couldn't help but remember the old missing persons case that had haunted our town. Years back, a girl named Emily had disappeared without a trace. Posters with her face were all over town. The police had searched high and low, but she was just gone. It was like she'd been swallowed up by the earth. And now, staring at that skull, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled upon the answer that everyone had been looking for. The police arrived, and as they dug, the memories of Emily's case flooded my mind. She used to love that oak tree, always hanging out there, writing in her journal. It was like a part of her life story, and now it was tangled up in the gruesome mess. Bits and pieces started emerging from the dirt. Bones, shreds of clothes, even a necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. It was like piecing together a nightmare. The more they found, the more it became clear that Emily hadn't just run away. Someone had done something terrible to her. News spread fast, and the whole town buzzed with a mix of shock and dread. Friends and family of Emily had waited years for answers, and now they were getting more than they bargained for. The person responsible for this horror had been somewhere among us, maybe even smiling and pretending all this time. Months passed and the cops worked their tails off. It was like a puzzle coming together, piece by piece. They finally pinned it on a guy who had known Emily. An old acquaintance turned out to be a sick, twisted killer. It was a relief to know he was off the streets, but it didn't change the fact that our town would always carry the weight of what had happened. As I stand here now, looking at that oak tree, I can't shake the chills. The sun doesn't feel warm anymore, and the shadows feel different. The mystery of Emily's disappearance had been solved, but it was a nightmare we couldn't forget. The backyard, once a sanctuary, was now a graveyard of secrets.
I was walking to the bus stop, expecting the usual hum of the city's early morning routine. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks. Blood everywhere, on the bench, splashed against the glass of the shelter, and smeared on the pavement. A woman's purse lay open, the contents strewn about. Nearby, a man's tie was soaked in red. No bodies, no screams, no evidence of what had happened. Just silence and that overpowering smell of iron. I stumbled back, a cold sweat forming on my brow. Panic gripped me. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling, and called 911. The sight never left me, and neither did the questions. What had happened at the bus stop? Where were the people? The city moved on, but every time I passed by that place, a chill ran down my spine. The bus stop was never the same for me again.
I thought it was an ordinary Tuesday evening. The sky had started to turn a light shade of orange, and I decided to take a shortcut through the alley behind the local grocery store on my way home from work. Walking past the store's back door, I noticed a grocery cart, seemingly abandoned against the wall. It was filled with what I first thought was a bunch of discarded clothes, but as I got closer, I knew something wasn't right. Peeking out from the pile of clothing was a human foot. My heart raced and I froze on the spot. I moved closer, thinking it might be a prank or doll, but the terrible stench that filled my nose told me otherwise. My hands trembling, I reached out and carefully shifted some of the clothes aside. What I saw next will haunt me forever. There, lying amidst the tattered clothes, was a lifeless body of a man. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly upwards, and his pale skin contrasted sharply with the dark pool of blood that had formed beneath him. The cut on his throat was deep, almost surgical. My mind raced. Who could have done this? Was it a random act or something more sinister? The back door of the store was ajar. Could someone inside the store be involved? I wanted to scream, to run, to call the police, but my body wouldn't let me. Then I heard a noise, the unmistakable creak of the door slowly opening. I turned my gaze towards the store's back entrance. The silhouette of a tall figure emerged from the darkness, holding something that gleamed in the dimming light. I didn't wait any longer. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, not daring to look back. All the while, the image of that lifeless body, the deep gash on his throat, and the mysterious figure haunted my thoughts. I made it home, but I didn't feel safe. It took me a while to gather the courage to call the police. By the time they reached the spot, both the body and the cart were gone. They took my statement, but couldn't find any evidence or any clues about what had happened. Now, every time I pass a grocery store or see a stray cart, that horrifying memory floods back, and I'm reminded of that evening.
In the dusky light of the reptile enclosure, the still form of a man lay sprawled. It's always a rush, the first cut. and with each thud of the cleaver, I felt a sense of liberation. Silence reigned, except for the soft hiss of the snakes, waiting. I've always loved animals more than people. My friends, the lions, tigers, and pythons, they understood. They didn't judge. They didn't lie. People, they were just noise. Always wanting, always taking. It started simply. An unruly visitor here, an unsufferable coworker there. Each time, I'd see their greed, their deceit. I'd hear the growls of my hungry friends, reminding me of the balance, and so I restored it. I remember the first one, a man laughing as he taunted a monkey. Later that night, the lions feasted well. The thrill of it was intoxicating. The power, the control, the hush after. Nobody ever suspected the quiet zookeeper. Why would they? The police were baffled. Disappearances multiplied. But the animals, they seemed healthier, happier. The circle of life, I suppose. The reptiles were my favorite confidants. Cold-blooded, like the world, they didn't mind the tales of my deeds. They understood nature's way. Kill or be killed. Tonight was no different. The still form at my feet was a vendor who'd been cheating his weights, overcharging kids for stale popcorn. "For the children," he'd say, with a smirk. My pythons were more deserving. I knelt, slowly pulling out my knife. The work needed to be done. It wasn't about anger, not anymore. It was about setting things right. As I worked, the hissing grew louder, a serenade for the zookeeper who understood the true order of things. The next day, the sun painted golden streaks across the sky as the zoo gates opened. Families poured in, their laughter a stark contrast to the events of the night before. The reptile enclosure drew a particularly large crowd today. They marveled at the pythons, thicker and more vibrant than they remembered. If only they knew. My colleague, Lisa, approached me eyes wide. "Have you seen Gary? He didn't come in today. That's so unlike him." I merely shook my head, feigning concern. "Perhaps he's sick." Lisa hesitated for a moment, biting her lip, then whispered, "You know, there are rumors. People are saying there's a curse on the zoo. Visitors, staff, they're just disappearing." I hid a smile, maintaining my facade. "Superstitions, Lisa. It's a big city. People come and go." But as days turned into weeks, the rumors grew louder. Whispers became warnings. Visitors dwindled. Still, the zoo animals thrived. My friends never looked better. One evening as I was locking up, a figure approached me. Officer Daniels, the local police. He had that stern look, his eyes scanning me, searching. "Evening," he said. He greeted. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Certainly," I replied, heart pounding but face calm. "What's on your mind?" There's talk," he began, "about the murder of people going missing around here. About the number of people going missing around here. You've been working here a long time, haven't you?" "All my life," I replied. "I love it here." His gaze shifted momentarily to the lion's cage, the mighty beasts staring back, almost protective. "Strange," he mused. "How well fed they look, despite the drop in visitors." A silence stretched between us, the weight of suspicion heavy in the air. He finally nodded. "Keep your eyes open, and if you see anything unusual, let me know." I watched him leave. The hunt was closing in, but I wasn't ready to be hunted. That night, with the cold silver of the moon as my witness, I made a plan. They may suspect, but they wouldn't catch me. The next few days were a cat-and-mouse game with Officer Daniels. He'd make surprise visits, always asking questions, always watching. There was no doubt he was onto me, but he lacked evidence. His persistence was almost admirable. I started being more careful. Instead of using the zoo grounds, I began scouting areas outside the zoo for my activities. Abandoned buildings, old warehouses. It became a more complex game, but the thrill was invigorating. Late one night, while scouting a dilapidated barn on the outskirts of town, a sound froze me in my tracks. Footsteps. I hid behind a stack of old hay. Heart thumping, waiting. A flashlight beam danced around, stopping abruptly as a figure stepped into its light. Officer Daniels. He wasn't here by coincidence. He'd been tailing me. I escaped unseen, my heart pounding in terror. His persistence was starting to make me uneasy. I didn't return to the zoo after that night. This city was onto me. The legends of the cursed zoo grew, and soon, tales of the zookeeper who favored animals over humans became the stuff of urban legends. Far from the city, in a secluded cabin, I found solace. The company of wild animals, the simplicity of nature. I may have left the zoo, but my mission remained unchanged, and while the city's memories faded, the legend lived on. whispering around campfires and in hushed bedtime stories. The old Faulkner mansion sat atop a barren hill, its windows dark and blank, like the eyes of a long-forgotten doll. The townspeople spoke of its checkered past only in hushed whispers. Lena, a young journalist, arrived in town seeking tales of the unknown. The Faulkner mansion, with its tales of vanished families and eerie sounds, was a story she couldn't resist. One evening, as dust settled, Lena, driven by her insatiable curiosity, decided to venture inside the mansion. The setting sun cast a reddish hue, enveloping the mansion in an atmosphere of mystery. As she stepped over the threshold, the air turned cold, hinting at secrets that lay buried within. She moved from room to room, each space telling its own silent story. In the main hall, a grand clock, long silent, began to tick as Lena passed by, as if awoken by her presence. The floorboards above creaked, hinting at unseen footsteps. In one of the rooms, Lena found an old diary, its pages yellowed with age. It belonged to a woman named Clara Faulkner. The entries spoke of love, betrayal, and a shadowy figure that Clara feared. The last entry, dated the night Clara vanished, read, "He knows my secrets. The shadows grow longer, and I fear I may not survive the night." Suddenly, Lena felt watched. The feeling of unease grew. She began to hear faint whispers, echoing Clara's words from the diary. The mansion seemed to come alive, its dark history unfolding around Lena. As she delved deeper into the mansion, Lena stumbled upon a room sealed off from the rest. Inside, she found paintings of the Faulkner family. One in particular stood out, a portrait of Clara. Her eyes, through just strokes of paint, seemed alive with fear. Just as Lena was about to leave, the door slammed shut. Panicking, she tried to open it but found it jammed. A shadow moved across the room, its form indistinct. A whisper, "Closer now," sent shivers down her spine. "You know my secrets." Using all her strength, Lena managed to pry the door open. Without looking back, she fled the mansion, the whispers fading into the night. Back into the safety of her car, her breath ragged. Lena looked up at the mansion one last time. In the window of the sealed room, the faint silhouette of a woman stared back, her gaze pleading and full of sorrow. Lena left the town that night, her story unfinished but forever etched into her mind. The Faulkner mansion continued to stand, its secrets kept, waiting for the next curious soul to venture within.
I've always loved the comforting predictability of living in a small town, every day the same. Until today, when I was walking home from work, I was suddenly struck with the sensation of being watched. Across the road, a man sat inside a gray sedan, smoking and staring directly at me. A shiver went down my spine. I picked up my pace, trying to shake off the unease. But the car started and it began to trail me. Panic bubbled inside. I quickly turned onto Maple Street, praying he'd lose interest. But it kept following. Cursing myself for leaving my phone at home, I looked around for an escape. There was an alleyway up ahead and it beckoned. I darted into the shadows, hiding behind a dumpster. I barely breathed as the headlights swept over the alley before continuing on. Believing he was gone, I made my way towards the wood that led straight home. As I entered the tree line, a chilling hand covered my mouth, and a raspy voice whispered, "Don't scream." It was him. My heart raced, fear threatened to immobilize me. But a memory from an old self-defense class kicked in. Using all my might, I stamped on his foot and I elbowed his stomach. He grunted, loosening his grip just enough, and I broke free. I ran blindly through the woods, the sound of his pursuit close behind. Yet I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Veering left, I reached a familiar creek that streamed directly into my backyard. Emerging from the woods, the lights of my house beckoned. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, and then called the police. They arrived swiftly, apprehending the man who, as I later learned, was linked to numerous unsolved abductions. My escape had not only saved me, but had brought a monster to justice. The incident shook my sense of security, but it also revealed a strength I never knew I had.
From the time I was small, my world was different from others. I saw people not as beings of emotion, but as mechanisms, complex puzzles to be solved. And eventually, I realized that I could dismantle these puzzles, piece by piece. Her name was Lisa. I met her in a coffee shop. Brown hair, blue eyes. A writer, but there was something different about her. A way she looked at people as if she was trying to read their story. I found that interesting. I'd been watching her for weeks, observing her routine. The way she bought her morning coffee, always the same. A cappuccino with a shot of caramel. The way she sat at the same corner table every time, the one near the window. The way she scribbled in her notebook. The way she bit her lower lip when she was deep in thought. One day, I sat down at her table. She looked surprised. "May I?" I asked. She nodded. I introduced myself as Mike, a journalist. We talked about writing, about observing life. I watched her light up as she spoke about her novel, about the complexities of human emotions. A week later, we started dating. She was charming, fascinating. Her innocent curiosity about people, her passion for capturing the human spirit in words, it drew me in, but all I could think about was how to take her apart, piece by piece. On our 5th date, I invited her to my house. She agreed. The house was secluded, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. She loved it, said it was serene, perfect for a writer. Little did she know it was perfect for other things too. That night, after dinner, I offered her wine. She accepted. I had slipped something in it, something to make her unconscious. It was a calculated risk, but it worked. She collapsed on the sofa, unconscious. I tied her hands and feet, gagged her mouth. Then I sat across from her, watching as her eyes fluttered open, the confusion, then fear crossing her face. There was something enthralling about it, the raw human emotion. It was what I had been waiting for, to see how she, a writer who captured emotions so elegantly, reacted when faced with her own mortality. It took her 3 days to die. In those days, I watched her, watched the hope slowly drain out of her, watched as she struggled against her bindings, as she screamed through the gag, as she cried, as she begged. And through it all, I took notes, observed her, absorbed her. I dismantled her piece by piece. When it was over, I buried her in the woods behind my house, under the large oak tree. No one would find her. Lisa, the writer who loved capturing human emotions, became a memory, a secret buried deep within the earth. After Lisa, there were others, each one unique, each one a puzzle to solve. And with each, I became more proficient, more effective. It was a game to me, a game of observation and destruction. But there was always something missing, something that kept me craving for more. You see, while I'm able to deconstruct them, while I'm able to study their fear and pain, what I've never been able to understand is their hope. That flicker of hope that remains to their last breath. That hope of being saved, of surviving. That's that one piece of the puzzle I've never been able to dismantle. That's the piece that keeps me going, keeps me hunting, keeps me living.
In the summer of 2023, a renowned local photographer ventured into the heart of the dense woods, attracted by the misty sunrise over the river, hoping to capture a once-in-a-lifetime photograph. Instead, discovering something far more chilling. There, drifting along the river's current, was a body. The corpse was a young woman, eyes wide and lifeless, staring into the gray morning skies. Her golden hair fanned out in the water around her pale, bloated face. Detective John McLean was assigned to the case. The victim was identified as Jenny Richards, a bartender at a local tavern. The killer had been merciless, throwing her body into the river, but leaving footprints in the mud, hastily covered with a handful of branches. The autopsy report revealed a chilling fact. Jenny's death was not due to drowning, but strangulation. She had suffered a dislocated jaw and had dark, finger-shaped bruises encircling her neck. Looking into Jenny's past, they discovered an unsettling pattern. Jenny had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Tom, and he had a history of violent outbursts, a trail of restraining orders and court dates. Witnesses at her job reported seeing the two in a heated argument the night before Jenny's death. The suspicion fell heavily on Tom. However, he remained defiant, rebuking any accusations. Tom had an alibi for the night of the murder, his friend vouching that he was at his place, drowning his breakup sorrows in alcohol. They needed physical evidence. Remembering an old forensic technique, McLean asked the coroner to run a UV light over Jenny's body. The black light unveiled the faint fingerprints imprinted on Jenny's throat. The prints matched perfectly with Tom's. A search warrant for Tom's residence was secured, where the investigators discovered a pair of muddy boots that matched footprints found at the riverbank where Jenny's body was dumped. Armed with the incriminating evidence, the police arrested Tom. Despite his denial, his alibi was found to be a lie. his friend confessing to lying under Tom's coercion. The court ruled that Tom had killed Jenny and discarded of her body in a rage, sparked by their breakup and fueled by alcohol and anger. Tom was sentenced to life in prison without parole, where he'd never see freedom again. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. This is Blood and Breakfast, and don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.
You're listening to Blood and Breakfast, the most important meal of the day. All characters and events depicted in this work are entirely fictitious. On a chilly November evening, a small-town sheriff named Jack Carter was startled by a frantic knock on his door. It was Mrs. Thompson, a resident of the quiet town of Clearwater. Her face was as white as a sheet, her hands trembling uncontrollably.
John, my husband, he's dead.
Sheriff Carter was immediately at alert. He pulled on his coat and followed Mrs. Thompson to her home. There, lying in a pool of blood, was Mr. Thompson, a well-known businessman, lifeless with a knife protruding from his chest. The crime scene was ghastly. The room was a mess, the furniture upturned, the couple's photo shattered on the floor. It was clear a struggle had taken place. Sheriff Carter started his investigation. The town hadn't seen a murder in decades. As he asked around, he discovered the Thompsons' housekeeper, a certain Miss Emily, had abruptly quit just a day before. That was a lead worth following. Emily was a quiet woman, barely in her 20s. She lived alone on the outskirts of town. When questioned, she admitted to an argument with Mr. Thompson over unpaid wages.
"But I would never kill him, Sheriff,"
she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. As the investigation continued, a more complicated picture of Mr. Thompson began to emerge. Many in the town had held grudges against the man for his ruthless business practices. Some had even voiced their wish for him to be gone. Among these voices was Mr. Thompson's own brother, Richard, who recently lost his store due to a deal gone wrong with John. Could it be family grudges had escalated to murder? Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was acting suspiciously. Her grief seemed forced, and she seemed unusually eager to wrap up the investigation. Then came a startling revelation. She was having an affair with a local mechanic, Sam. Sam had no alibi for the time of the murder. He was known to have a violent temper, and his fingers were stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. But it was just engine oil, or so he claimed. The list of suspects was growing, but there was still no clear motive. However, an old diary found hidden in Mr. Thompson's office hinted at a secret that could tie everything together. It detailed Mr. Thompson's shady past as a con artist who had betrayed many, including his own brother, to amass his wealth. The day of the murder, it turns out, was the anniversary of one of his biggest cons. The victim of that long-ago scam had sworn revenge, and it was all documented in the diary. That victim was none other than Sam, the mechanic. The final pieces fell into place when Sheriff Carter found a knife set in Sam's garage, one knife missing. The knife matched the one found in Mr. Thompson's chest. Faced with the evidence, Sam confessed to the murder, driven by years of simmering rage and resentment. In the quiet town of Clearwater, the shock of the murder and the revelation of the killer's identity sent ripples through the community. The shadow of past deeds had finally caught up, and in its wake, it left a chilling lesson. That the seeds of crime sown in the past can bloom into a terrifying reality. You're listening to Blood and Breakfast, the most important meal of the day. All characters and events depicted in this work are entirely fictitious. On an unforgiving winter night in Riverton, under the spectral glow of a bar's flickering lights, sat Jack Crawford. He nursed his whiskey like a balm for his soul, grappling with the impending doom of his fractured marriage. As a man of wealth and influence, his public facade was a stark contrast to the chaos brewing within him. In the same bar, Ethan Montgomery, an unassuming teacher, sought refuge from his own storm. The burden of his wife Rachel's escalating medical bills threatened to submerge his family into an abyss of debt. Under the heavy veil of their desperate circumstances, the two men found themselves face to face. Friends in their youth, their lives had diverged. That night, their paths intertwined once again, not in camaraderie, but in shared desperation. Their conversation flowed, fueled by whiskey and desperation. Jack's failed marriage to Olivia threatened his wealth and social standing. In contrast, Ethan found himself on the precipice of ruin, brought about by Rachel's debilitating illness. Their conversation took a grim turn when Jack presented a horrifying solution to their mutual plight. "We can help each other, Ethan," Jack proposed, his eyes holding a chilling glint. "We can make them disappear." From that night, an insidious plan began to form, seeping into their lives like a deadly poison. Jack would stage a tragic accident to end Rachel's life, while Ethan would orchestrate a fatal incident for Olivia. They wove their plot with alarming precision, their correspondence hidden in anonymous letters, cloaked with code names and cryptic language. They moved like ghosts in the night, their treacherous actions shielded from the world. Under the shadow of a moonless night, Jack executed his part of the pact, slipping a lethal dose of poison into Rachel's nightly medicine, weighing heavily on his conscience. As he exited the house, Jack felt the enormity of his actions. In contrast, Ethan sabotaged Olivia's vehicle to introduce a catastrophic failure, ensuring it would occur on a notorious stretch of road known for its fatal accidents. The day came when Olivia unknowingly embarked on her final journey, leaving Ethan behind, now a man burdened with a dreadful secret. Riverton mourned the tragic losses of Rachel and Olivia, oblivious to the malevolent undercurrents that connected the two deaths. Detective Andrea Hayes, a seasoned investigator with a keen eye for detail, sensed something amiss. Her pursuit of the truth led her down a twisted path involving Jack and Ethan, their shared history, and an eerie web of deceit. As Detective Hayes dug deeper, the consequences of their monstrous deeds began to suffocate Jack and Ethan, their alliance fractured under the strain of paranoia and fear. The climax of their despair came when Ethan, unable to bear the crushing weight of his guilt, confessed to their horrifying pact, thrusting Jack into the merciless glare of the law. The courtroom reverberated with the heinous details of their vile pact. Riverton was left shaken as the horrifying depth of their betrayal was laid bare. Jack and Ethan were convicted for their crimes, leaving their families shattered and the town forever marked by their atrocities. Thus, the tale of Jack Crawford and Ethan Montgomery remains a chilling testament to the devastating paths that desperation and greed can carve, permanently scarring the soul of Riverton, their once idyllic hometown. In the aftermath of the trial, Riverton was a town forever changed. The residents had lost their innocence, and the scars left by Jack and Ethan's betrayal were etched deeply into the community's psyche. Their once serene hometown had become a place of haunting whispers and lingering shadows, the echo of their horrific crimes still resonating in the hearts of its people. In the cold solitude of their prison cells, Jack and Ethan were left with nothing but the bitter taste of their regret and the damning silence of their thoughts. The ghosts of their deeds haunted them, whispering endless echoes of guilt and remorse. As they grappled with their solitude, their sanity teetered precariously on the brink of despair. The magnitude of their actions, a dark abyss from which there was no escape. Years later, Jack and Ethan crossed paths one final time. Their reunion was marked not by the camaraderies of their youth, but by the chilling weight of their shared guilt. Their eyes met, two hollow reflections of their monstrous deeds they had committed. There was no forgiveness to be found, only the echoing silence of their shared damnation. The tale of Jack Crawford and Ethan Montgomery remains etched forever in Riverton's history, a grim reminder of the depths to which desperation can drive ordinary men. Their horrifying pact and the devastation they inflicted on their loved ones serve as a bleak warning. a chilling testament to the haunting dance of greed and despair. The town of Riverton continues to heal, forever bearing the scars of the chilling deeds of two of its own. The legacy of Jack and Ethan's betrayal lives on, casting a long shadow over the town, a constant reminder of the darkness that once lurked within its borders. You're listening to Blood and Breakfast, the most important meal of the day. All characters and events depicted in this work are entirely fictitious. Episode 1, Flames of Deception. In the picturesque town of Crestwood, a veil of deceit concealed the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. Amelia Sinclair, a renowned socialite, lived a seemingly idyllic life with her husband, William. But behind closed doors, their marriage was a suffocating prison of manipulation and emotional torment. One fateful evening, the tranquility of Crestwood was shattered by a devastating fire that engulfed the Sinclair residence. The flames licked at the night sky, casting an eerie glow upon the horrified onlookers. As the inferno raged, screams echoed through the neighborhood, a symphony of terror and anguish. Firefighters battled the merciless blaze, their valiant efforts uncovering a gruesome discovery amidst the smoldering ruins, a charred body, beyond recognition, lying motionless in the remains of what was once a beautiful home. The sight sent shockwaves of horror through the tight-knit community, forever etching the trauma into their collective memory. Detective Michael Thompson, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for his tenacious pursuit of justice, was assigned to the case. With each step he took through the charred remains of the Sinclair residence, the weight of the tragedy pressed upon him, threatening to consume his spirit. The stench of burnt wood and sorrow lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the horror that had unfolded within those walls. As Detective Thompson delved deeper into the web of deceit surrounding the Sinclair family, he uncovered a tapestry of pain and manipulation. Interviews with friends, family, and acquaintances unveiled a fractured relationship between William and Amelia, their union an intricate dance of control and submission. Behind their polished facade lay a tangled mess of shattered dreams and broken spirits. A tip led the detectives to Nathan Anderson, whose obsession with her had festered like a cancer in his soul. Nathan's seething resentment towards William and his desperate desire to possess Amelia cast a dark shadow of suspicion over him. Detective Thompson delved into Nathan's troubled past, uncovering a history of violence and twisted infatuation that sent shivers down his spine. Through the ashes and rubble, the detective discovered a shattered wine glass, its delicate fragments tainted by the residue of a lethal poison. The realization sent a chill through his veins, a chilling reminder that the horrors of this crime extended beyond the infernos that consumed their lives. Witness testimony shattered the illusions of Amelia's innocence, revealing inconsistencies in her alibi that tore the fabrics of truth. Doubt seeped into the hearts of those who once saw her as a pillar of grace and sophistication. The town's collective grief transformed into a simmering cauldron of suspicion, leaving a stain on their collective consciousness. In the pursuit of justice, Detective Thompson unraveled a trove of damning evidence, a series of incriminating emails between Nathan and Amelia. The chilling correspondence laid bare their sinister plot, a conspiracy born from twisted desires and a thirst for power. The detective's hands trembled as he read the words, each syllable an echo of the darkness that consumed their lives. Interrogations plunged Amelia into the depths of her own deceit, where she could no longer hide behind her carefully constructed facade. The weight of guilt pressed upon her, breaking down the walls of her defenses, and she confessed to orchestrating William's murder. The truth spilled forth, painting a macabre portrait of a loveless marriage, suffocating control, and a desperate quest for freedom at any cost. The courtroom became a stage of raw emotions as Amelia Sinclair stood trial for the murder of her husband. The evidence presented painted a vivid tapestry of a woman consumed by deceit and driven to commit the ultimate betrayal. The haunting echoes of her deception reverberated through the hushed halls, seeping into the very bones of those who bore witness to the horrifying truth. Crestwood, forever marked by the echoes of deceit, carried the scars of this tragedy long after the courtroom drama ended. The survivors, traumatized and broken, sought solace in the flickering light of hope. Detective Thompson, haunted by the intricate web of lies he had unraveled, carried the weight of their trauma upon his shoulder, a burden that threatened to drown him in a sea of darkness. As the town slowly healed its wounds, its collective consciousness forever changed, the echoes of deception became a haunting reminder of the fragility of trust and the depths to which human nature could descend. Crestwood emerged from the shadows, its spirit bruised but unbroken, clenching onto the flickering hope of a brighter future, determined to rise above the horrors that had once consumed their lives.